My name is Rami Shami. I work as a case manager for the Second Mile Club at Kensington Health. I've been in hospice palliative care, serving within hospice palliative care for a long time, since I was 19. So I began my journey as a caregiver or carer when I was very young, um, and it's part of my makeup, part of who I am, but also part of what I do. Especially since I have two parents that I'm caregiving for, and one who has somewhat of a tumor in her neck. My mother, who's undergoing treatment right now, but I'm taxed, and I say it taxed with doing this professionally, and then doing this informally for my parents. Um, folks, like, even we could even stop at this slide, to be honest with you. The the fastest growing, if not the largest, aspect of caregiver support has been offloaded. And I say offloaded because I feel a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was some policy changes and some um, momentum, let's just say, because I can't quote the policies and the laws and what have you, momentum to turn, a lot of the care that's provided for people living with a life-limiting illness, such as cancer, right? um, Back onto families, right? Back onto whatever would be defined as a family. Many a times in the social sector, in healthcare, we define family nuclear or just somewhat extended. But of course, working with people experiencing homelessness and structural vulnerability, and we look at communities who may be refugees or immigrants or indigenous peoples, it may be very different in terms of how they define family. But regardless, somebody else was providing the care. And as we have an aging demographic that's living longer, not necessarily healthier, but definitely longer in that regard, or getting sicker younger, right? I don't have the stats on that. It's hard to, bring up the stats, but are not necessarily living better. And our long-term care facilities are pretty full. There's 4, 5, 6, 7 year wait list. We have a smaller wait list here, especially during COVID. Um, but that's taxing a population of care providers and caregivers who are informal or carers that are usually between the ages of 18 to 45, right? And there's also another demographic of care providers, and that's under 18. And we won't get too much into that. That's a whole other presentation. Those are classically defined as young carers, right? People under 18 who are either caregiving for their mother, father, or parent, to be exact, or for a sibling, for a parent, or for a grandparent in any regard. And historically, because I've been in the field for a long time, I've seen how the demographic of caregivers has obviously changed because of some of those factors I just mentioned. Um, when we used to say caregiver or carer, and the two terms are almost interchangeable, although they have some somewhat distinct definitions. We used to think of somebody caring for their older adult wife, right, or husband, or what have you. But it's really, really changed. And then part of it is how our communities and societies are built. North America has somewhat of an individualized approach. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, and this is not generalizing, especially since we have other communities that are not like this, where it's pretty nuclear. Somebody gets sick within the family, it results in a family member caring for them. And if it's a parent, or a grandparent, or even a sibling, it ends up being one of the children that care for them. That's not exclusive. It's definitely not exclusive. We can go on to an infinite number of dynamics as such. But that's what we've seen happening, right? I work in a lot of multicultural communities where it isn't quite the same, where the community is defined as broader reaching and different in a way it supports its members or its people. But these programs, for example, young carers and caregivers, often end up being in a demographic of people that are between 18 and 30, 40, 45. I began caring for my father, who had 5 heart attacks and a stroke and was suspected to have cancer. And he had some surgery, and not to get too personal about it. Um, and for about 15, almost 20 years now. So even though I did it for a living, I also took care of it as a family. And some of the experiences we've had as younger carers um, can be defined as some of the feedback I'm going to give you today, and see if it, and why I share this with you, because in some ways I want to normalize or attempt to normalize the experiences of younger carers, what it means to them, what happens, what are some of the feelings that are very normal that happens to them, and almost advocate for some of the resources, which one of the best resources is a group sharing. Like Josie spoke to it. I find it, especially for younger carers, I find it there isn't many places where friends get tired of hearing it or don't want to hear it, maybe. Family sometimes back off. Like my brother completely backed off and left me with the care of my parents. So I have to do it all. Um, so I have in these groups, we have an opportunity to relate sometimes not, I wouldn't say harsh, but harsh to hear of ourselves say it, in terms of what we feel as younger carers in caregiving for somebody within our family, and how it affects our lives. It affects our jobs, it affects our schooling, it affects our relationships, it affects our sense of independence. I mean, I think it was Emily that just spoke to that. That's why I asked about that. Just these aspects of our lives that get almost torn away from us. So in these groups, such as the caregiver group Josie spoke to, it offers us an opportunity to normalize what we feel and create a safe space with other, which is the peer support model, which with other people who are providing caregiving that are feeling the same thing, right? And we can't necessarily say it outside those walls because there'd be judgment, there'd be fear of retribution, there'd be guilt, right? So yeah, we'll move forward with this now. So my work, folks, as I've mentioned, has spanned quite a long time. And I've seen, especially, and I support people living with cancer and dying of cancer. I've seen and bared witness and had the honor and privilege of being in the presence of many different demographics of young carers. And I have to say, um, different ages of demographics, different ages of caregivers um, relate and react to caregiving differently. And actually, if I could just even modify that or expand on it, different generations of caregivers. It's amazing when I support caregivers or carers who are of older age, advanced age, how they often say it's my duty, it's my responsibility, it's what I'm supposed to do. And sometimes I feel that comes from a generational piece, right? Perhaps, that's how I feel. Whereas maybe in our generation or even younger generations, there are aspects of our being that are maybe we aren't structured, the society isn't structured as such, that we do have a higher emphasis on autonomy and choice and individuality and equity of access to a life, right? Than maybe in years past. Um, my mother has no issue being cared for by my father, and vice versa, or me caring for them. But in many ways, I know if for me, how I feel much of my life has been robbed, has been taken away. Even though it's my profession, it's not something I can run away from or get away from it. And it's very, very taxing because, and I'll speak this a little bit more, there's even family experiences growing up with those parents that become challenging when I end up being their caregiver, and I've experienced a great deal, or we've experienced a great deal of maybe abuse, trauma, alienation, abandonment from the people we're providing caregiving for. I can't tell you how often I hear, and I have one such caregiver. She's lovely. She's caring for a parent that abandoned her when she was small, and now she's gone back to support him because of a number of reasons, which I won't break confidence in. So we get drawn in many ways. And in the years that I've been in hospice palliative care and worked across the province and the country and down into the US and Trinidad and what have you, I've seen how much more the load is on younger and younger carers, more than at any time in my career, at least in the past 30 years. And there's a number of factors for that. One is, as I mentioned, the healthcare structure. Maybe it's overloaded. Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe it's an expectation, but it's been offloaded a lot in terms of younger carers. Young carers have access to much more information now than they did in the past. Maybe that's a byproduct of it. Um, and maybe perhaps, like as I mentioned, more and more older adults are living longer and living not necessarily as well and have no place to go, especially the way our communities are possibly structured, especially in Canada, and end up being in the hands of care of their children, right? Or the children of somebody else. Because I know some young carers aren't limited to just caring for their parents, they're actually caring for somebody else's parents. Another piece is that a lot of my work is on in homelessness and structural vulnerability, where once again, because the average age for people living on the street, I believe, is in their late 20s, early 30s. And people usually don't live on the street past 45, 50. They usually actually die. It's very hard to stay on the streets. Adds a whole other dimension of what a young caregiver is, right? When it's somebody caregiving for someone else who's living on the street, either a partner or a parent. There's one individual that I supported. She was caregiving for her dad, who ended up dying with us of cancer, and a great deal of mental health stress and financial deprivation, and not being able to hold a job because of the caregiving duties she had. And at the same time, they lived together because they were both experiencing some aspect of structural vulnerability. So there's quite a gamut to being a younger caregiver. And I'm happy that that Wellspring and Kensington Health has offered us the opportunity to shed light on it. And folks, without being too dramatic, they're actually this in many ways younger carers, all right, are the silent suffering. They Caregiving support is for the most part, I wouldn't say accepted, but advocated for or permissioned for older populations. Most of our groups, and it's getting better. The one we have at Wellspring is fantastic because it has a mixed age demographic, anywhere from 25, 27, all the way up to 70, right? And somehow they meld. They teach one another, they support one another. And I think Josie can attest to that. But another caregiver group that I support, it's all older adults. So it'd be hard for somebody of a younger demographic to step in there. So it ends up being, in many ways, for younger carers, the silent suffering and the unsupported sufferers, right? There's some good programming, for example, like the one at Hospice Toronto, of young carers under the age of 18 and supports for them. But when it comes between 18 and 20, it's almost as if we age out, right? Between 18 and 20 up to around 40, 45, the groups are older demographic average. The supports and resources are more geared towards either that younger population or an older population. And then on top of that, for the most part, and most likely, we either going to school, having our own families, however we define family, finding ourselves, or have our own jobs, right? On top of that, and on top of that is a full-time job and caring for somebody, right? So that age demographic, I think, is the most challenging, the most silent, right? And the most taxed right now for the different domains with which they have to deal with their own life, their own job, their own development, right? As an individual, as a person, their own hopes and dreams, right? Which all become somewhat curtailed by this caregiver responsibility. And folks, I've heard it, from younger carers that say, I hate what this has done to my life, and I feel robbed and I feel cheated, and this is not fair in any ways, and those are valid, very valid experiences. The challenge also right now, as I feel and I'm seeing, the expectation of the healthcare in Canada is for younger carers to caregive for their family members. Well, when you have in long-term care average wait list of 4 years, 3 years, above and beyond all the negative news and publicity that's happening for long-term care, that's a long time to wait to receive any kind of support. And then if it's somebody with an active diagnosis, an active illness such as cancer, and it's progressive, there's no time for long-term care. There's no need for or opportunity for long-term care. And if we add even other pieces to that, especially now, folks, with COVID, we're having a lot of challenges with personal support. If somebody's living at home with cancer and needs personal support, there's a shortage of personal support in the home. And there's also challenges with personal support with infection control and COVID. So maybe I'm shedding more of the challenges than giving you solutions, but we'll talk a little bit more about the solutions in a in a minute. So that's me, folks. I met one of the most incredible caregivers, Ms. June Callwood. That was when I was very young, but I haven't changed much, right? And I feel I'm very fortunate because I spent so many years of my life being trained in caregiving. I mean, I became a hospice volunteer at 18, 19 years old. So I learned how to provide care and support, and in many ways take care of myself as a nature of the work that I was doing, before I ended up even getting a job in hospice palliative care. But we really don't teach that. We don't teach it in schools, how to be a caregiver. And we really should. If we're going to teach sex ed, and we're going to teach, Trumpism, and we're going to teach political science, and we're going to teach, iPads and Apple and Androids and what have you, and social media, why are we not teaching grief and bereavement, death and dying, and caregiver support? Because a lot of that's what I'm teaching my child. She's 9 years old right now. That's what I teach to my child right now, is how to be a caregiver. What are some of the aspects, and how to provide caregiving without getting lost in the caregiving? And if you do, what happens to it? And how can you extract yourself? Do you want to extract yourself? How do you set boundaries for your own life without feeling guilty? This one individual, she's a brilliant woman, and she's caregiving for her mom. And she said to me yesterday, she says, I'm lost. I asked her, so where are you in this caregiving? Because she has a fledgling career. And she's like, I'm lost. And she never once in the hour that we spoke to her needs, because of a sense of duty, responsibility, guilt, and not even the space within her family, because she has young children and a husband, of where she fits in all that. We haven't even broached the subject of LGBTQ plus and or indigenous peoples when it comes to accessing caregiver support for younger carriers, right? So I was fortunate in some ways, and I still had these feelings of my childhood being robbed, my youth, my education, my everything got affected by being a younger caregiver. But I had skills because I was taught at an early age, and I wonder if that's part of it. A lot of the education out there isn't that much education about how to be a caregiver. There's resources, right? Look up on this website, read this report, and I'll share them with you, right? Maybe come to some caregiver support groups, but to actually have, not necessarily now that COVID, actually have hands-on training. And I would love, actually, it's given me some ideas of developing a caregiver training program for caregivers. There isn't much out there. There's some hospital resources and some supports from social workers, but to learn how to provide caregiving, especially for somebody living with cancer, how to support yourself, how to identify and be aware of the feelings and emotions and thoughts and even physical sensations that percolate when we're providing caregiving, how to create safe space, how to be maybe mindful of it, develop a mindful practice in reflecting and dissipating and de-stressing yourself as a caregiver, how to take, maybe this is the right word, take ownership of your life at the same time it's being handed to a caregiver role, right? How do you maintain that ownership? And if you can't, what do you do with those feelings? How do you seek help? How do you find help? How do you help yourself? Right? So I think that's a big piece that we're missing in the communities these days, and I hope we can develop some kind of learning and education for that. We'll touch on some of them today. Anyways, that's when I was very. Yeah, I hear you, Josie. It is very much needed. I'd love to take because I do a lot of training and education. There's another aspect, folks, like especially I find with younger caregivers, anywhere from 18, 19, 20, 25 to mid 30s or 40s, losing so much in caregiving for someone else, especially a parent, right? Or even siblings, but parents, because most of us, that's what you end up doing, is the fact that and sitting with pain and suffering as a result of cancer of somebody that is in your midst, right? It doesn't even necessarily even have to be direct caregiving, but in your midst. It was said today, I think Emily said it, this shock, right? There's a traumatization to it. There's a traumatization, as some people, have mentioned in the group, of spending 13 years caregiving for somebody. 13 years, that means if you're 45, you started when what, 33, right? And just in the prime of your life. And there's a traumatization to that. And there's a visceral experience that invades the body that even changes our brain and changes the way we think and feel. And there's a piece to developing as an adult from the time you're 17, 18, 19, 20, while you're bearing witness to somebody you're caring for having cancer and living with cancer. There's a there's a how can I, almost like a change in how you develop. And I've heard this from young carers, how they say, I grew up too fast. And that could be at any age, or I missed out on a part of my development, or part of what has happened to me has changed the way I developed. I feel older than I am. I feel like, um, or maybe even folks, and I've heard this from some younger carers, is that parts of me have underdeveloped, right? Yeah, I developed a great deal in this aspect, but over here, these aspects of my life have not developed. Jose, I'll definitely get back to your question. This is being recorded, so I want to maintain your confidentiality. All right. um, Anyways, so in that regard, folks, I'm hoping that we could bring across a deeper education to younger carers. I wish actually we infuse it in our school systems, to be honest with you, because the wave and momentum of the future is that more and more younger adults are going to be caregiving for older, sicker parents, right? Or family members, or even friends, right? And I have a close colleague who knows what I do for a living, a friend of mine from many, many years ago. He says, I don't want anybody else taking care of me, not my brother, not my sister. I want somebody trained like you to come and care for me, because I don't trust what might happen. And that's another piece, right? Folks, I heard this from one caregiver. She said she's also younger, in her mid 30s. She said, and she's caring for her father, and she will not let it go because she loves her father so much. But she's exhausted. Her back hurts. She feels, as she said, falling apart. She said, if I'm doing this for my father, who's going to do it for me? And that's something I hear a lot from carers, because it doesn't mean, your younger care means we're married, or we have partners, or we have other family to care for us. Who that comes up a lot, this vicarious traumatization of our minds as we look to care for somebody else. As we're thinking to ourselves sometimes, what about me? Is anybody going to care for me like this? Is anybody trained to care for me like this? I'm doing this for someone, but if something happens to me, what happens to somebody caring for me? And in many cases with younger carers, one of the aspects of it is, if something happens to me, what happens to if you have children, what happens to my children, or what happens to my partner? And if you're alone, right? And I know have some people I support who are alone in their 20s or 30s, and they say to me, if I get sick, then what's going to happen to my parent that I'm caring for right now? So, and that adds the load of pressure that is already at a peak. And I'll be very transparent with you folks. We have resources, there are groups, there are supports, but caregivers are the silent suffering, and we really don't have much. I don't have answers for everybody. I'm going to give you some resources, and we're going to have discussion, but we have to build a strategy. And the way to build a strategy, and the way to there's some great reports that have come out, but I haven't even seen much of them in terms of their implementation. Way to build a strategy to hear more and more from people like yourselves. How, what, where. We probably should have a younger caregiver group separate, right? That works, such as with Zoom. It works. I mean, one of the gifts of COVID, if I could call it that, is the propagation and explosion of Zoom, so that younger caregivers can jump on a Zoom from anywhere, work, caregiving for a family member, and join us. But we really need to hear more from people like yourselves to advocate, to create an even stronger voice, to bring you even greater resources. In any case, folks, I mentioned that I work for Kensington Health Center. Very proud to be here, but I also consult in hospice palliative care across the province. Work a lot with programming for cancer and support organizations such as Gilda's or Lighthouse for Grieving Children. I'm part of a program here called Second Mile, but I also work at the hospice and psychosocial support at the bedside. And of course, I provide caregiver support, but grief and bereavement support. And that's a really important piece, folks. If I can speak to that, I recognize there is one of the avenues that really feel we need to look at in terms of younger care um, support is in grief and bereavement. So a lot of the older adults I support, many times they say, well, we lived a good life. Well, you know what? I didn't expect this now, but we're in advanced stage. I mean, it's not me saying that. That's them saying that. Well, it took away our retirement, but we've had 40, 50 years together. So the grief and bereavement is different. It's a different density and a different feel to it. But when I talk to or hear from younger carers, 18 to 45, the losses are at times very different. And the grief associated with those losses is very silent. One, maybe because there isn't access to it. We don't recognize it as grief, or we don't recognize it, or we don't have space for it because we're so busy providing caregiving, or we think we shouldn't because we feel guilty to give any feelings to ourselves while we're caregiving for a parent when they've given us so much, if they have, right? So there's one of the aspects that's hidden and quiet and silent is the aspect of grief and bereavement as a young carer. And yet I find it is more pronounced and more insidious and more taxing than at any other stage in life and development. And you can imagine, I'm sure anybody on the call today, is a call today, on the Zoom today could speak to it. What have you lost? Maybe we'll talk about that later on. The things that we've lost, we lost a sense maybe of individuality. Again, I'll show you these. Individuality, a sense of maybe a future, a sense of a different future, a sense of privacy, a sense of time, a sense of education and time for friends or time for ourselves, or even physically exhaustion, mental exhaustion. There's all these things that can be lost that have an aspect of grief to them. Grief isn't necessarily about death. Grief is an emotional internal reaction to loss. So I ask, especially younger carers, what do you feel you've lost? What are some of the losses you're experiencing? And what do you feel about those losses? That's one of the most powerful interventions in being a younger carer, right? In many, many cases, in most cases, there's not much more we can do to take away the load. All right, let's just be transparent and honest from that. We're in a position where we have to provide this caregiving. Nothing's going to change it really, right? Maybe some resources here, maybe some advocacy here, but the load is there. That's what I'm seeing, right? But in the emotional, psychosocial, even existential experience of the load, maybe there's a way we could vent that so our nervous system isn't always in fight or flight and overburdened and taxed. And some of that is in recognizing how the experiences make us feel and finding a place for them to be shared. As Josie mentioned I would love to say your name as you say it, Josie, and find them a place where they can be acknowledged and safely shared. And what I'm finding, folks, what I'm actually also finding, or what we're finding, and again, I suspect others have experienced this, is this added dimension of COVID. I think at no other time in my history, in my life, have I seen the struggles of being especially a younger carer than at this time in a pandemic. And the reasons are multiple. We're trying to caregive for a parent that either we've had to move in with, or they've moved in with us, or in my case, I actually, because I work in long-term care and hospice, which was very, very hard for me to make this decision, is to move away from. So now I have to caregive for parents, one of them who has a tumor in their neck, from afar. And that's very difficult, especially when you have not just when you have a child, but from afar, because the guilt that carries, or the sense of even perceived abandonment, or what we hear from the people we're caregiving is that, you've distanced yourself, you've left us, or you're too far away, right? Or even how much we give up of our lives to move in with them. And I did that when I was very young, to provide caregiving, to support, to be in the presence of, and how much we're going to lose in that. And now with all the self-care interventions somewhat blocked, our activities, our outlets, our socialization, all have been thwarted and blocked. So it's just almost this pressure building up, especially for younger carers who are on top of that, sometimes still trying to go to school at home, trying to go to work at home, or trying to do one or the other, as my partner, my girlfriend does, one or the other while having children at home, and then caregiving for somebody in the same environment. So there's that's why I speak about it. And I hope it doesn't sound too how can I say dramatic when I say there's a traumatization to it. There's an activation of our fight or flight that leaves us so overwhelmed and so jacked or hyper aroused that that in and of itself can be the source of exhaustion and mental strain, right? And why I bring this to your attention is not because I could tell you how to dissipate it. Sure, there's some mindful practices I could teach you, or meditation, or some aspects of grounding, but just for you yourselves to recognize it within yourselves as it manifests. And then that recognition is one of the first aspects of self-care or care for the self, to how to navigate those. And then we find ways to navigate those. But COVID, um, I never thank for COVID coming, but COVID has brought a lot of attention to the plight of younger carers that hasn't happened until now, right? So this is an opportune time, I feel, and I'm taking the charge because here I am speaking to you folks and you join us, to really advocate and push for what we need in terms of providing supports for younger carers, especially during this time. So I want to acknowledge some of the experiences, some of the things I hear from younger carers, and these aren't necessarily, they resonate with me, but I would love to share them with you. I can't tell you, especially as younger carers, how often I hear them feeling robbed, their life robbed or stolen away from them. And they don't dare say that in the presence of many, but they'll say that in a group or say that to me in a one-on-one session, right, for caregiver support. They feel, and there's so many aspects of that could be robbed or stolen, their education, their time to be educated, their mental health to be, to learn or study, or to to watch an episode of Lost, or to do in activities and what have you. But the feeling, the sensation is that I've been robbed, right? I'll never forget this one caregiver just a few weeks ago. She says to me, I won't say this to anybody, but I'll tell you, I've been fucking robbed, right? I'm 23 years old. This is not okay. And there's this feeling that things have been taken away from them, right? And if it isn't necessarily happening now, the feeling isn't happening now, there's a fear, an anticipatory fear that this is going to happen because they could see it. Whoever I'm caring for is going to live with this cancer maybe for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, right? How much is going to be taken away from me, and I'm going to be lost of in that time frame. And that acknowledgement has a certain grief to it, has a certain sense of emotion to it, even perceptibly, even looking at it forward, that these are going to might be lost, and we start to feel it right now. And at the same time, it starts to infuse the caregiving, and then it has nowhere to go. Some feel that their life has been tainted. Again, these are things I've heard from younger carers. Their life, which isn't necessarily, and not as commonly heard from older adults, over 55, 60, 70. They feel their life has been tainted, and tainted in a way that that it's been touched by pain, suffering, and disease, especially with respect to cancer. There's a tainting to it. And I use that word because that's how the younger carer talked about it, a tainting to my life. My life is never going to be the same now. I'll never know if I can actually go back to school, have a partner, get married, if I want to have children, adopted or biological, whatever. It's been tainted, and now what do I do, right? Some younger adults, I was caregiving for, actually just a step below the 18-year-old mark. I was caring for a young man of 11 years old who was actually, because his dad was always at work, had to be at work because his mom got sick. They were dual income, one child. He had to be home caregiving for his mom. So he'd come home from school, back when kids are going to school in person, which hopefully they'll be going back very soon, I think on the 16th. And he'd come home and provide caregiving for his mom. But you know what he'd say to me? And this is a number of years ago. I went in to support him, and more to support him in his experiences. And something that he says really helped him, because he ended up caregiving for his mom for about 3 or 4 years. I was with him for 2 years, and then his mom died. And he ended up going on to be leadership scholar, and he did very well in his life and his education. But I think a lot of it happened there. His mom had a brain tumor, and the brain tumor was so severe that it actually changed her face and changed her skull structure. So he'd look at me and go, "That's not my mom anymore." And all his family members would look at him and say, "You know, Johnny," we'll call him Johnny, right? "Johnny, that is your mom. Stop talking like that, right? You know that's not nice, right?" And he'd look at me and say, "That's not my mom anymore." And you know what he was trying to say, and especially as younger carers, because I think younger carers are probably more adept at navigating grief. We're talking about a little bit more now. What he was trying to say is that he felt the grief of losing his mom, that she didn't look the same, talk the same, do the same things for him. And when I worked with him in our sessions, we'd only work on permissioning and holding space. We didn't work on much, just permissioning and holding space for his feelings of grief as he caregived for his mom. We also talked about all the things that he felt he was losing, like he couldn't go outside and play basketball, he couldn't do this, couldn't do that, because he had to caregive for his mom. What he found, because we did a not a case study, but a summary at it, and was the fact that he could express his emotions and how it was impacting him and his life and all the losses he was experiencing from 8 to 13, especially when I was with him, was extremely helpful in his development, because it got him in touch with feelings that wouldn't be suppressed and repressed into later in his life. And that's something that young carers, I hope, can acknowledge, is to bring these experiences and thoughts and feelings into a place, into acknowledgement, into awareness, so they don't remain suppressed and repressed, and show up 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Because again, there's a traumatizing aspect to caregiving. I love this one, and I hope I say that sensitively. The young carer said, "I'm not able to be my age," right? So there's a loss there. What does it mean to be your age? Well, to feel like this, to do this, to date, or to be with a significant partner, or not to always be providing caregiving so that I can be with somebody, right? All the other things that are acknowledged as part of being that age demographic are lost. There's a grief to that. The grief can be expressed as, anger, resentment. To be transparent, one younger carer in her late 20s, early 30s, she said, and she said this in confidence, right? And she felt guilty about it, but she said, "I just wish she'd hurry up and die." And there's nowhere else she could talk like that. She says, "I don't really want her to die." And the perception that's important is that it's not that she wants her to die. She wants the tax and the suffering of being a caregiver at her age and all that she was losing in her life to go away, right? But anybody else hearing that would see that as cruel, right? She couldn't be her age, 29, 30 years old, okay? There's also sometimes this feeling of being jaded about the rest of their life. They look at other people and say, or they're not caring for nobody. And my friends are doing this, and they're telling me to go out and hang out pre-COVID. They're having chat groups on Facebook and Instagram, whatever, and they're doing all these activities. And that's another whole piece, folks, that maybe we should one day talk about, especially for younger carers who are, without being too generalistic, are usually more subscribe more to social media. But when you subscribe, not bad or good, but when you subscribe to social media as a young carer, sometimes you can't help but see how other people are living their lives, especially Facebook and Instagram and what have you. Usually we show our best selves for the most part, okay? And the younger carers will look there and go, well, look how happy they look, and look how glowing, and look where they're traveling to pre-COVID, look where they're going to, and look at this, and look at my life, right? And I don't know. I don't feel necessarily comfortable to share on social media what I'm going through, or I don't want people to see me like this, tired and exhausted and sad, or and there, in and of itself, there can be a disconnection as a young carer from the rest of society as it's being demonstrated and exhibited on social media, right? And that can leave a person feeling jealous, envious, jaded, right? Resentful, anger, all things I've heard from younger carers. younger caregivers, right? As they reflect on their lives as it relates to what they see on social media. Very common, they can say that life isn't fair, right? And that speaks to a lot of other aspects of it. And that sometimes comes under their breath, that life isn't fair. Yeah, but I used to feel this way. My parents came from a war-torn country, went through a great deal of racism and difficulty being here and grounding here in Canada, and they built themselves up. Then they get sick, and I have to take care of them. And I'm like, that's not fair. I want a life. I want to, and then it conflicts with, wait a minute, look what they gave up for me to have a life. It's my duty and responsibility to care for them, but I still feel it isn't fair because I'm losing so much of my life. And then we get these conflictual feelings as young carers that, especially, I say especially a lot, maybe because I really feel this is an important point, especially Ontario, where we have a large population of immigrants, first generation, second generation Canadians, third generation refugees, sometimes come from other parts of the world, right? And then their children, like myself, end up providing care for them and feel that duty, responsibility for what has been sacrificed, and yet we don't have maybe the community support, whatever, to help us, and we feel it's not fair. And at the same time, it's a conflictual feeling. Well, it's not fair, but I maybe wouldn't be here in this beautiful, wonderful country with all of our dark history, but it's in many ways it's still a wonderful place with that conflictual feeling, right? Um, but I also hear from young carers in this age demographic, and again, I attribute myself to one of those. Is this experience of being re-traumatized? So a number of carers, including myself, that provide care for a family member who may have been abusive or traumatizing as a child, and I think that's a very challenging place to be as a young carer. So I experienced a lot of developmental child abuse, a lot of developmental trauma growing up. My parents had PTSD coming from war-torn countries. So now I'm providing for the past 20 years care for them, for the same people who caused me a great deal of harm and trauma. Now we have a relatively stable relationship now. But what I ask for young carers in these kind of predicaments and situations, what does that bring up for you? Right? That's not necessarily a feeling of caregiving. That's a feeling of being re-traumatized. That's a feeling of facing your abuser. That's a feeling that you can't turn away from this, right? And maybe that needs a different level of intervention and support and counseling, or at least acknowledgement, because it's triggering that which has been dormant for years and years and years. My experience of childhood trauma didn't resurface until I was in my 40s, and I'd already been caregiving for about 10 years, right? Providing caregiving for 10 years. And so there's this aspect of re-traumatization that needs kind of its place in permissioning, and it's not as uncommon as we think in Southern Ontario, right? For whatever those reasons may be. I remember hearing this young carer saying, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to have to give up my going to university and coming home and taking care of my mom or dad," right? And folks, like when we talk about uh, who we care for, it could be, especially young carers, it could be anybody. It's not just our necessarily our parents. It could be a husband, right? A young carer could be a husband or a wife or a partner, and again, I hear that sometimes from young carers. I didn't sign up for this. And not to break too much confidence, but as somebody mentioned in one of the groups, 13 years caring for a partner. That's your prime years, right? That have been lost, or aspects of it might have been perceived to be had lost, right? And there, I feel there needs to be an acknowledgement of that. But it could also be grandparents. More and more younger carers are not just caring for the parents, but caring for their grandparents. Um, and of course maybe even siblings, right? If a sibling is ill, it doesn't always have to be an older adult that they're caring for. And times, especially on the streets of Toronto, if it's friends or family, right, that are considered considered family, that they're providing caregiving for, right, for whatever responsibility or accountability that they've been assumed. Anyways, it's a whole rich conversation, and I really want to advocate strongly for more support for younger carers, not just older adults and a different younger 18 to 40, 45. We need a lot of support there and a lot of time, and to really acknowledge the cascade and collateral and multiple losses that go with being a younger caregiver. So, as I mentioned before, young care, it's a common term, not a common term, but it's a designation for usually for somebody providing caregiving under the age of 18. I like to say younger care, which it's also kind of judgmental as well. What do you define as younger, right? But we need something to tell us where we are. It's really anybody between 18 and 45, right? Even though I fall out of that now, I came from that demographic. And so that population right in there, I feel is feeling the heaviest load of all time when it comes to providing caregiving. Again, for all the reasons that we can go on with. But just to provide a bit of a definition, right? The actual terminology for younger carers is a person who's under 18 who cares unpaid for a person who has any type of physical illness such as cancer or mental health or disability, right? Or substances, right? I don't like that term, misuse of substances. Substances are used to oftentimes to cope. So anybody under 18 providing some form of caregiving, right? And actually the majority of it is cancer. But that being said, folks, there's about, check this out. I mean, there's about 3 million family caregivers in Canada, over 3 million family caregivers. The load is enormous. And you can imagine the cascade of how can I say, not damage, but suffering and hurt and exhaustion and burnout that's happening across the country. I think caregivers are at the whole burnout piece is at an all-time high because of as a result of the load on caregivers. However, 17% of young carers statistically are between the ages of 15 and 24, right? And it's growing. And I'd say, and I should be quoting this, but I'd say the percentage of carers between 24 and 45 is probably 50, 60, 70%, right? The majority really is in that time and in that time of life. So thank you for your comment, Josie. That being all said, folks, let me just put some stuff out there. I think I've really spoken to some of the experiences and maybe normalized, hopefully, or brought out of the shadows or brought forth some of the experiences of younger carers, right? There is some legislation and policy and programs that I want to share with you that is being developed to safeguard the health and well-being of younger carers. Still nowhere near enough, right? So I do welcome you. We might actually be starting a younger carers program here at Kensington, or maybe even with Wellspring conjunction. But our group drives pretty well with the different age demographics. And I don't always feel like it has to be older adults, younger carers. In many ways, it does work when we have mixed age groups, and for a number of reasons. I think it's really important to recognize the needs of younger carers. They can be, and we'll talk about a little bit about some of the physical support. I mean, that's taxed right now because PSWs are a very scarce commodity for, again, a number of reasons. One, infections, demands, can't work in multiple places, can't work in the home at the long-term care facility. But I think really importantly for younger carers is the mental, emotional, psychosocial, spiritual, existential support. I think we really need to work like that. And in the groups that I run here and at Wellspring, that's what we focus on from a peer support model. And peer support means other people who are experiencing similar journeys of caregiving come and talk about their experiences. And somehow we help each other, we provide insights, but most importantly, we acknowledge and share that which we're feeling. We're trying to work on some of the financial burden placed on family carers, especially younger carers. Some people have, like this one individual, she had to give up her work, right? She's very highly trained in what she does and very specialized. She had to give it up because she just could not be on call for her mother. Now, there's not much we can do about that except for the fact of support her psychosocially, emotionally, and advocate hopefully for some financial relief, which it's still a ways away, right? So much of younger carers incur out-of-pocket expenses, meaning they have to, maybe their parent or whoever they're caring for is not working anymore. They have to give up some aspects of their work. So I had to give up a lot of my work and I couldn't focus on it, which was a loss in and of itself. Because I think to myself, where could I have been now if I didn't have this load, right? And there's some benefits that I can find that I've been helped to find in being a caregiver for a family member with cancer. But I have to be reminded of it, because oftentimes it's clouded by all the expenses, especially financially, emotionally, mentally, that have come in providing that support. There are some compassionate care benefits now, especially in some tax breaks. We could send you some resources on them for people who are providing caregiving. So I used to receive those when I was providing care for my parents at home. But as soon as I moved out because of COVID, I couldn't utilize those anymore. And there are access to social workers and what have you. I'm not a social worker, but I am a um, peer support, right? Case manager. And so we're able to provide those supports. And that's really the extent of it right now when it comes to younger carers. Some other things, there's part of my advocacy, folks, is the education piece, the building of awareness and education of the plight of younger carers, and normalizing their experiences, and helping in some ways, especially through some measures of grounded mindfulness, some of those care for the self strategies that we speak about in the groups, especially the groups, to dissipate some of the fight or flight response, the stress, the traumatization of it, recognition of that sense of traumatization, and just to prevent it, hopefully, from being suppressed and or repressed, right? So that years down the road, it doesn't pop up and consume your life or cause you any kind of even physical ailments. A lot of the work by Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Gabor Mate, talk about how stress and trauma, as a caregiver, we're not talking about acute violence and wars. We're talking about spending 13 years, 5 years, 4 years caring for a family member, a loved one, a partner with cancer, and what that does to our bodies, because the stress, the trauma of it, the experience of it overwhelms us and ends up in our bodies. I advocate very strongly to peer support groups. I think I also work with, as I mentioned, Lighthouse for Grieving Children, where we run groups for children who have experienced the death of a family member, either a parent or a sibling. And it's incredible the power of a peer support within those. And I find sometimes it even either complements or even trumps one-on-one support in that regard. Not to take away from therapy and counseling, it definitely has its benefits and its interventions, but we can't always afford it or have access to it. And I think peer support is really something else. I've spoken a lot to the mental health aspect of it, but let's be mindful of the physical and emotional health as impacted by the caregiver's role. There is, I'm appreciative of, in terms of what COVID brought us in terms of Zoom. So we have greater access to supporting younger carers. But what we're trying to build right now is a greater awareness on social media, like LinkedIn, like Instagram and Facebook, about the plight of caregivers. And in fact, folks, I'm a part of a soon to be launched. I'm part of a music video put on by a group that focuses on caregivers, and includes some pretty famous musicians, which is really cool. But it's another way to reach younger carers, because we can't always be looking at it in one particular angle. We have to we have to be able to access a larger spectrum of that. And I ask younger carers to, and again, COVID brought this to light, to look at their workplaces and see if workplaces have, advocacy for caregivers. Do they have time off? Do they have leave? Do they have support? If not, maybe, in some way we can garner that within their organizations, especially with some strong advocacy groups like ACE, right? I think a lot of organizations are now catching up to speed that they need support, education, awareness within their organizations for their staff, and within schools for their students. Schools, usually universities especially, have usually more support. But if you work somewhere and you want somebody to come in and speak to your organization, let us know, because we can bring that at usually free of charge, right? I mean, that's what we do. We're not for profit. to bring in awareness of building awareness within work environments, within leadership, governance, managers, supervisors, and even each other, what we might be carrying as a caregiver. Okay. All right. I wanted to leave some time for discussion, but here's a couple of websites, folks, for younger caregivers. All right. You can look up www.youngcaregivers.ca. I used to work for Heart House Hospice, and they have a great website and a good program for younger carers, but also for caregivers in general. There's also us, Kensington and Wellspring, in our groups, but we're not focused yet on younger carers, which I think we should build a program. And then, of course, there's the young carer program at Hospice Toronto, right? That focuses on people under the age of 18. They have a fantastic program over there in that regard. Okay. All right, folks, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to end the recording now, and then we can have a discussion. That's my email. Please feel free to contact me, contact Wellspring, and we'll be happy to somehow find some way we can support you, either with groups, resources, hearing you out, one-on-one support. But we definitely want to be able to be there for you. So thank you.